Hello, everybody. Welcome. So today's topic at SBA Barcelona is the new work permit regulations in England and their effects on players and clubs. My name is Mali Koido, and I'm a sports agent based in England, working internationally, so quite involved in bringing players from other countries to play for English clubs. And we also have Christian McLaren, who works for Arco Management. He's an expert in player adaptation, player care, a little background in Argentinian football, and working with some top Latin American talents. So he will be talking us through player adaptation and needs of players coming from further afield to the UK today. And we also have Carol Cowles. Carol is a leading sports lawyer here in England. She's a part of Milton Reeve, and again, quite heavily involved when it comes to international transfers from other countries, especially quite often involving non-EU players coming into England. And hopefully David Webb is also going to join us. So hopefully we'll see him in a couple of minutes. So today's seminar really is geared towards agents, clubs, lawyers, but really anyone who is involved in bringing players from other countries to play professionally in England going forward, and how the new rules might impact them. And I know that there's quite a few agents or aspiring agents in the audience as well. So SBA Barcelona's next agent course or certificate in football intermediation starts in March. So if that's something that you're interested in, then definitely check out the website. But without further ado, let's get started. So if you want to ask any questions or you have any comments during discussion, please type them into the chat, and we'll take them as and when we can as we go along. So first of all, Carol, obviously you know a lot about regulations, the previous ones as well as the new ones. Can you please talk us through and just a bit of an overview of what has changed and when did these changes come into effect?
Sure. So the main change is that work permits, or GBEs, so governing body endorsements, were needed for non-EU players. And from the 1st of January of next year, GBEs will now also be required for EU players following the end of the transition period after Brexit. So that clearly that's going to have a huge impact on player recruitment. So there's a shift in who the regulations apply to, but there's also a shift in the focus of the regulations. So the previous GBE requirements were based on having an automatic pass if a player had played a sufficient percentage of games over the last 2 years for his national team, and if that national team were ranked high enough in the FIFA rankings. And that's an auto pass. There's a provision for the players having played it for the last 12 months if the player's under 21. And that's reflected in the new criteria. So just by way of illustration, so if a team is ranked in the top 10, a player will only have to have played in 30% of that national team's games over the last 2 years. He's been available to play, so where he hasn't been injured. If the team is ranked 11 to 20, you have to play 40% of the games, 21 to 30, 60% of the games, and 31 to 50, 70% of the games. So that can be the auto pass. It's an established international, but obviously there are likely to be those players that don't satisfy that criteria. So what do they have to do? Well, previously, the criteria was based around what transfer fees were payable and what salary was payable to the player. And it was all about how this compared with the average Premier League transfer fees and salary. So clearly, there was an inflationary effect as the years went by in terms of what the player would have to satisfy and what the clubs would have to satisfy in order to obtain this GBE. And so that was, I think that was identified as quite a hurdle really for clubs to overcome. So now in this new criteria that's going to apply, it's still a points-based system, and it's objective criteria again, but the criteria is more about the player and his history, so his playing history. So first of all, even if a player doesn't get this auto pass, so even if his national team isn't in the top 50 and he hasn't played the requisite number of games, he can still acquire points depending on the number of games he has played for that national team. So that's one thing, and that's over the last 24 months if he's over 21. How many minutes he's played in the last 12 months for his club, and the clubs are ranked in a number of bands, so 1 to 6, and so the top band will be, the top 5 leagues, and then the lower leagues are ranked accordingly, according to the FA and the Home Office. There's then a point that you can acquire for continental minutes, and the continental competitions that really count here, and this is interesting, are UEFA Champions League and Copa Libertadores in Band 1, and UEFA Europa League and Copa Sudamérica in Band 2. So there's an acknowledgement that continental competition in Latin America is of equal standing to the European competition. So I think that's probably one key point to draw. And then other points can be acquired depending on what position the player's previous club finished in its league, how the player's previous or existing club progressed in the continental competition last season, and which league the player is transferring from. And again, there's obviously a subjectivity around where leagues are ranked, but there's a ranking, the bands 1 to 6, as I mentioned before. So yeah, you've got to acquire 15 points. Just for this January, there's going to be an exceptions panel, and this is only going to apply in exceptional circumstances. So really, it's going to be quite strict in terms of being able to satisfy this criteria. And the other thing, I guess, that's worth noting is there's going to be a cap on the number of under 21 players that can be signed this coming window, which is 3. And then for next season, it's going to be 6. These are under 21 players that aren't nationals, that aren't UK nationals, English nationals.
And obviously another really big change is regarding players under the age of 18. And that's obviously a little bit separate in terms of the logic that it follows. But can you talk us through why players under the age of 18 can no longer come to English clubs? Yeah,
so FIFA has a general rule that prohibits the transfer of minors, and it's more about sort of the protection of the minors. Effectively, the theory is minors should stay in their country of birth in order to develop and progress their careers and move on later. However, there's a sort of exception, a well-established exception, that between the ages of 16 and 18, players can move between the EU and EEA. And this is basically an acknowledgement that there are free movement rights. So workers, and you can be a worker at the age of 16, so workers can freely move between the EU, EEA countries and take up employment. So therefore, FIFA acknowledged that they couldn't impose a rule that would go against EU law. So there was this exception, and it's obviously a long established exception. The practical impact of this, obviously, for English clubs and for UK clubs, is that the UK clubs are no longer part of the EU EEA, so they are no longer able to transfer players in at the age of 16 from Europe. So the likes of Eric Garcia, Cesc Fabregas back in the day, these players that were crucial signings at the age of 16, 17. The UK market is not going to have access to those European players to bring them in, and this might be a competitive advantage for the continental clubs, because obviously they're going to be able to retain that talent until the age of 18. I guess the one caveat to that is that FIFA has recently announced that I think they've announced the wording now. So if a transfer takes place between two associations in the same country, that is also an exception to the general prohibition on the transfer of minors. And the understanding is that players moving between the home nations, the UK, are, whilst they're still international transfers because they're moving from different football associations, that will be permitted. And again, it's sort of a tacit acknowledgement, really, that these players, can move freely within the UK and take up employment. And therefore, whilst technically it's an international transfer, it's acceptable within the UK to do this. I guess the one sticking point is probably Ireland, the Republic of Ireland. And again, whilst normal workers can move because of the Common Travel Agreement, normal workers would be able to move from Ireland to England and vice versa. There isn't the exception there because obviously the Republic of Ireland is still part of the EU. So therefore, I guess it was a question of opening up the floodgates if there was some sort of exception made for football there. But clearly there's a bit of a disconnect between general free movement rights and what's allowed in football.
And that's obviously a huge change for English academies because so many top players from countries all around the EU at the age of 16, 17 would make the move to academies like Chelsea or Man City, and that's just not going to be the case. So I think, in my opinion, probably a country that's going to have quite big advantage is Germany, because obviously Germany, up until now, have been trying to compete with the wages that we offer here in England. Whereas now, I would maybe imagine that wages for younger players around Europe might go down as a result a little bit.
Yeah, I think, Premier League clubs have traditionally been able to pay sort of a premium for these players and often, acquire really talented young players. I guess part of it is the draw of the Premier League, and part of it is maybe the financial pull of those clubs. And yeah, you wonder whether it might have a deflationary impact on players' wages at that level, or whether the likes of Germany, where perhaps there are less restrictions in terms of the recruitment of players, provided there's a certain number of national players in the squad, maybe it's going to work to the Bundesliga advantage.
So what's the actual impact then on players who are already playing in English leagues, either from the EU or also non-EU? So
taking the EU to start with, provided players are in the UK before the 31st of December this year, they can apply for something called pre-settled status or settled status. And effectively, that sort of guarantees their stay in the UK. And therefore, the GB requirements won't be relevant to them going forward. And I suppose the benefit of settled status is it's a period of five years, effectively, of living in the UK, and you acquire settled status. And then within 12 months, you can apply for citizenship. So effectively, you can live in the UK for life, and you would never have to have any immigration sort of compliance after that. So that's the key point about settled status. The settled status or pre-settled status, if you haven't been there for 5 years, it has to be applied before the 30th of June next year. So I think clubs are probably going to have their work cut out sort of managing this process, because it's the documentation and proving that the players have been there that long. And whilst I don't think the process is complicated per se, I think it's the mechanics of it and just getting the players on board with that. So that's EU players. Obviously, we've mentioned what will happen if the EU players are coming in after 1st of January. For those non-EU players, they will be they will have a GBE already. And there are two visa requirements. One is a Tier 2 visa and one is a Tier 5 visa. And I guess we can talk about those in more detail. But effectively, once they get to the end of their Tier 2 or Tier 5 visa, normally tier 5 will be 12 months and tier 2 maximum of 3 years. Once they get to the end of that GBE, then it's an extension of the GBE. So provided they stay in England, we don't have to go through all of the loopholes here. They can either have the auto pass if they're the established international and they've got the requisite number of games, so there might just be an auto pass, or they will look at the available domestic minutes that have been played. So provided the player's been fit and he's played, a certain number of minutes, then it goes to the relevant interested parties. So the relevant interested parties are representatives of the league, where the player is playing, the PFA and the FA, and they basically decide that if they're satisfied that the player, has been regularly playing, and if he has, then effectively, it's sort of rubber stamping process that he can stay in the UK. So it's slightly easier than going through all the loopholes, the hurdles on the new system.
Right. So quite a lot of work for clubs to do as well, because of the rules only came out a couple of weeks ago, and it will take quite a lot of time to adapt. Yes,
absolutely. And so I think the criteria is really quite, you basically just have to work through the criteria, and it's quite sort of statistic heavy. So I think there's probably going to be a lot of work for the statisticians within the clubs, and maybe consultation with the lawyers to sort of work out, is this likely to pass the test, basically. But actually, just talking on the tier 2 and tier 5 visa, I think it's probably relevant to point out the difference there. So the tier 2 visa is, so taking a step back, once a club has a DBE for a player, it then issues a certificate of sponsorship for that player. In order for that player to then work in the UK, he will also need a visa. And the visa can either be, as I've mentioned, tier 2 or tier 5. Now, tier 2 is the longer one. That's up to 3 years, or the term of the contract if it's less than 3 years. And tier 5 is 12 months, or term of the contract if it's less. So why would anyone go for the tier 5? Surely, everyone would want to go for the tier 3 because it's a longer term visa. Well, the issue is that with tier 2, you need to pass an English language test. And so obviously it might not be that, players from the continent or South America or Africa, they may not have English as the first or second language. So therefore, it may be the case that they come in on a tier 5 initially for the 12 months, and then they look to move to a tier 2 if they can pass the English language test after that. The problem is, when I've been talking about this pre-settled status, settled status, effectively the ability to stay in the UK without needing to have a work permit or visa, any time that's served under a tier 5 visa doesn't count. So the clock only starts ticking when you're on a tier 2 visa. So if you're, acting in the best interest of a player who may want to settle in the UK, I think it would be beneficial to come in on a tier 2 visa, obviously, if you can speak English. But sometimes the sort of emergency nature of these transfers, it could be, deadline day and the player just needs to get in and needs to be registered and needs to get in playing. With a tier 2 visa, it's pretty rapid. You can just come in, sign, get the paperwork processed. The tier 2 visa just takes a little bit of time because you've got to go through the process of this English language test.
Right. So the Christian, you've done quite a lot with helping players adapt and dealing with queries from agents who look to move players to the UK. So in terms of English language, what kind of role do you think that will play? I mean, how many players coming from, let's say, South America, in your experience, speak fluent English?
I would say the simple answer to that is very few. I mean, you could probably count on one hand the number of players that would be able to speak fluent English. I think, everyone's waiting to see how this is going to play out now. But I do think that it offers significant opportunities for English clubs looking further afield. with the ranking system, particularly with the Libertadores being put on par with the Champions League, and also the Sudamericana being put on par with the Europa League. There's teams from, let's say, for example, Venezuela or Colombia, not your traditional big hitters in Latin America, that could provide some great interest for English clubs. Of course, then with those opportunities, back to your point about settling, are a number of sort of hurdles to overcome, shall we say, for South Americans coming direct to the UK, if that does indeed happen. And that is how these players settle in. When a player moves country, they don't tend to move just on their own, but they tend to move with family, and sometimes even in Latin American cases, friends and large cohorts. Just like any of us who have lived in different countries, you need to overcome the basic stumbling blocks that enable you to get on with day-to-day life. You need to find housing, you need to find a car, you need to sort your insurance, you need to sort your phone contracts, many queries that come along from agents that we've had to deal with. Agents who haven't dealt in England as well will be well placed to engage an organisation or individuals who can support them and their clients to help them flourish and settle, because ultimately the player's happiness off the pitch is a huge contributor to their performance on the pitch. They're playing for 90 or 180 minutes sometimes a week. They're spending a couple of hours at the training ground each day. The majority of the time is spent away from the football pitch. So being happy in themselves, and also happy in the knowledge that their family and their loved ones that they've brought over with them are occupied, is also of paramount importance. This is crucial as well for the clubs. If clubs are investing heavily in talent, regardless of age, they should be doing their utmost to protect that investment, and as should the representatives of that player, because it's in everyone's best interest to look after the happiness and the comfort of the player and those that surround him.
Absolutely. So up until this point, how often do you get a query from an agent or a player further afield asking about English lessons or anything like that?
Well, yeah, I mean, as I mentioned the other day when we spoke, I kind of moved away slightly from the lifestyle management side of things, but particularly at the start, that was really the lion's share of our work, was sort of translation services and being that linguistic link, and that ultimately is the most important factor, isn't it? It's the language and feeling comfortable. When you're in a country and you don't speak the language, you feel like an alien. You feel like you can't get the most basic things done. So that was our most frequent query, and still to this day. I mean, I'm connected to lots of representatives and clubs in Latin America. I'm very Latin America focused. Been working in and with the continent for close to a decade or so, frighteningly. And so I'm very much in touch with them. They see me, fortunately, as someone who they can rely on to communicate effectively with them in Spanish and English, and not lose any of the sentiment and translation for their requests. So the language is vitally important, and that's why most players coming from Latin America tend to go to Spain or Portugal or Italy, because there are those cultural and linguistic links there. You know, Italy and Argentina are very linked, and of course the language is very closely tied with Spanish there, and Brazilians tend to go to Portugal. So we'll see how this shifts the dynamic.
Absolutely, because coming from, let's say, Colombia or Argentina and going to somewhere like Spain or Italy, obviously there's going to be a certain amount of adaptation in terms of football, style of play, culture. But obviously in terms of language and culture, there's a lot more similarity, and that tends to be a more traditional route for these players. So what do you think the arguments would be then for these players to instead consider moving direct to an English club? Maybe money aside?
Well, I think you've nipped it in the bud by saying money aside. I think the buying power of English clubs might be able to twist the arm of a few players and representatives, and indeed clubs as well. I mean, I think, as you know, South American clubs love having that link with big European clubs, and including UK clubs or English clubs as well, because it's a sign of great prestige if you sell to a big European club. It reflects very well on your youth system. I think the Premier League. We're taking the Premier League, and we can all. It's arguably the biggest league in the world. We've probably got some La Liga fans which would disagree with that, but it is obviously one of the most attractive sporting products worldwide. I would say more attractive than, let's say, Serie A probably. So I mean, it's probably consensus is that La Liga and the Premier League are in the top two there, and even now I think these changes of regulations open up potential avenues for Championship and even perhaps League One teams as well. The Championship, when we're all allowed back in stadiums, the stadiums are packed. It's one of the most watched leagues in the world as well, the Championship. So it's a very attractive place to come to play. And if you make a name for yourself in the Championship, then you've got the promised land of the Premier League just around the corner, perhaps, or onto other things in Europe. So I don't think players would need too much persuading, but I do think that those cultural ties, as you rightly mentioned, are really important. And also just it's the pre-existing networks that exist between certain Latin American countries. I mean, many Argentines I'm speaking from my experience, have Italian family, and in Italy still there's a huge crossover there in culture. As is the case for Brazilians and Portuguese. So it's very attractive, but it's again interesting to see how it will play out. Nice to have the option, I suppose, to go to maybe England, Spain, and Italy.
Absolutely. So we're talking about things like, for example, Copa Libertadores being equal to Champions League in terms of getting points. So, Karen, who do you think are the biggest winners and losers in terms of these new regulations? Because obviously it's going to be now a little bit easier for certain non-EU players to come in. But it might be really hard for certain EU players to come in. I mean, I was talking to Victor Orta the other day about the impact of these regulations in a similar setting. And he brought the example of Jens Petter Hauge, who's playing for AC Milan, and who is a Norwegian player. And obviously traditionally, English clubs have been quite keen on the Scandinavian markets because there's certain similarity in style. There tends to be some good value there. They can buy young players who already have 2 or 3 seasons of experience. And he said that someone like Jens Petter Hauge, who's obviously getting games in Serie A, wouldn't be able to join a club like Leeds purely because the new system wouldn't enable him to score enough points due to the league he was playing in, which is Norway, as well as national team ranking, etc., etc. But are there also any winners, any countries, or any leagues from where players previously couldn't even dream of coming in and now might have a good chance of getting work permits?
Yeah, I think the key, I suppose there's 3 issues. One is where the national team is ranked, and obviously established international, therefore, that's a route in. But if you fall below that, then that's not a given that if your team is highly ranked, if your national team is highly ranked, that the league, like the domestic league, is going to be highly ranked. So, for example, I think Sweden are ranked about 18 at the moment. I think they're the only country in the top 20 where the league isn't ranked, so you wouldn't get any points effectively for playing in the league, which is so I guess in that respect that could be difficult if you are perhaps a younger player playing in Sweden and you're breaking into the national team, but you haven't got the the requisite number of caps. So I think that might be difficult, and obviously previously there was no issue there. I mean, any of the countries outside the top 50, the EU countries, obviously things are going to be significantly harder. So the likes of Hungary, Greece, Finland, Bulgaria, Slovenia, there's no chance of an auto pass there because they're outside the top 50. So that'll be tricky. In terms then so that's the national team. Then there's the ranking of the domestic leagues. So as I've said, top 5 is where you want to be for the top number of points, which would be 12, and you only need to get 15 points. So if you're in one of the top leagues already, then you're pretty much there. Band 2, so Belgium, Portugal, Netherlands, and the Championship. Band 3, and this is where it could be beneficial for those Latin American leagues, so Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, and Scotland's on the same level, so that's band 3. Colombia's in band 4. So again, totting up those points make prizes. So that's where there could be an advantage, because there is the acknowledgement of those domestic leagues actually being of a really high caliber. You've mentioned obviously the Copa Libertadores and Sudamerica, and I guess the other thing is there's almost a double counting or triple counting really referable to the league, because there's a case of, well, where did the player's club finish in the league, so you can get points on that. So if it's a ranked team within a good league, then extra points, and the league itself gets points. So effectively, they're the real drivers, I think. So I think there will be advantages for the likes of the Latin American clubs. And I do think, I appreciate the English language element. Sounds like it might be off-putting for players, but they don't need to be fluent English language speakers. They just need to be able to pass a fairly straightforward English language test. So it might not be the huge obstacle that that potentially it could be. It's not that high a hurdle.
I think if I can just come in on that as well quickly. If you look at the current FIFA rankings as well, by my counting, there are there's 7 Latin American nations in the top 25 of the current FIFA rankings. I mean, if you look at Brazil and Argentina, you would expect those in the past regulations, you'd expect that the top performers there would be a given to come anyway. But look outside of that, and you're talking about Uruguay, Mexico, which I think is a really interesting market. Very few Mexican players in the UK at the moment, and they're ranked 9th in the FIFA rankings as well. So if you're performing regularly for Mexico, and with their links to the States as well, there's potential that you've got that little bit of a cultural advantage as well, and the English language. I think that is going to be a really interesting market. You look at someone like Jimenez, who's done so well in England over the last couple of years, and that could be really attractive to UK clubs, and also Colombia as well. From a playing style point of view, the market really well, Mali, and it's the players very physical there as well as technical, so it could be it's kind of the perfect marriage there, and I think that as well is going to be really interesting. From youth team level as well, you've seen Venezuela over recent years as well. Obviously, their ranking is a little bit lower, but if you're talking about international appearances from under 17 and onwards, then that is a really interesting one. They've played England in a final or two, I believe, over the last sort of 3-4 years at the top level. So yeah, I think it's certain markets to watch there. It's going to be interesting to see how clubs go about deploying more resources over there, whether they're still a little bit worried about tackling the Latin American market as they have been, and often it's been a convenient excuse, the passport issue, and now that's gone now. So we'll see if things change. I think they will. Personally, from my point of view, I hope they do. So we're quite well placed to deal with more Latin Americans if they come in.
Absolutely. Go on, Carol. Sorry.
No, I was just going to add, because prior to the system that was in place before, there was just effectively players had to play 75% of the games for a top ranked team in the top 70, whereas now there's sort of a sliding scale. So there's an acknowledgement that, well, this is under the previous system and also now replicated in this system. So there's a sliding scale, as I've mentioned, of number of games that a player needs to play, the higher ranked his club is. So there's an acknowledgement that those players are breaking into the Brazil side, the Argentina side, the Colombia, Mexican side. Ultimately, they are still top quality players, but there might be huge competition for the position that they play in, and they might be, some of the best players in the world. So there's an acknowledgement that actually, particularly the younger players, they're never going to satisfy that, 75% that we had previously. So there has to be an acceptance that those highest ranked teams, the players don't need to play quite as many games for those teams, given the caliber of the national side.
Absolutely, because previously, whenever you had any agent offering a player from normally Latin America, then probably your first question as an agent or a club would be, do they have an EU passport? Because it's obviously quite common in Argentina and Uruguay for players to have either Spanish or Italian passports, whereas in Colombia it's relatively uncommon.
Mm.
And there was always a hurdle in terms of players' quality, maybe actually being good enough to join an English club, but then from a visa point of view, that being pretty much impossible, and then having to explore options along the lines of Portugal or Holland. And if you look at Holland in particular, if you look at Ajax, for example, Ajax have had a lot of success in terms of bringing in young Latin Americans around the age of 18, because, again, the regulations in the Netherlands are a little bit different to what we have. And they've been able to find quite good value, give them games, and then sell them on. Whereas now, potentially, that could be something that the English club could also explore with players under the age of 21, if that's something that they see value in. Because obviously paying around 3 million for a very, very promising player is very different to paying 20, 30, 40 million for them 2 or 3 years down the line, isn't it? If anybody's wondering why Dave hasn't joined us, unfortunately, he's having some connection issues, but we're actually in touch over chat. So something that he would like to discuss from a club recruitment point of view, because David has obviously worked in a number of Premier League clubs as a key decision maker, obviously most recently as head of football operations at Huddersfield, as well as clubs like Southampton and Spurs. And he reckons that these regulations are probably going to drive certain clubs, probably sort of mid-table to lower in Premier League, to look at more innovation and looking at where they can find value, where they can get a bit of an edge. Because obviously, if you look at Man City, they have a huge global network, and they have assets in countries like Mexico, Uruguay. But if you look at those mid-table clubs, then again, previously, I think my discussions with them have certainly been a little bit limited in the sense that obviously players can't work permits. It's all about getting established in Europe first. And it might be the case that they are looking at strategies to find value in countries like Colombia and Argentina. So actually, Christian, obviously, question to you. You've lived and worked in Argentinian football for a period of time, and obviously deal quite a lot with Argentinian players as well.
Yeah.
In terms of the playing style, in terms of just the level of the league, Argentina, do you think there is value to be found there? Do you think that it's worthwhile for clubs to try and sign players directly from Argentina and find better value in doing that as opposed to signing a similar player from, say, I don't know, Hungary?
Yeah, I mean, the case with Argentina, and Argentines won't mind me saying this, is that they're in a constant state of financial flux, which means that the clubs are in often a lot of financial difficulty. So therefore, their prized assets, young players coming through, are available for often good value fees. Argentine style is obviously very technical style over there. Can be fairly physical at times, and actually quite direct, contrary to what most people associate with sort of the South American flair style. Yes, there are technical players and there is flair involved, but it is actually quite physical and can be direct as well. I would say that Argentina is obviously one of the most obviously identifiable markets for clubs to go and look at because of their footballing history and their heritage. I think it might be interesting also for clubs to explore alternative opportunities in other countries as well. So I think that would be they'd be wise to do that. And I think in terms of the pressure from and kind of off-field environment, they're used to dealing with serious pressure as professionals over there. I mean, football's a religion in Argentina. We've just seen, obviously, with the sad passing of Diego Maradona and the outpouring there. I mean, that tells you all you need to know about what football means to people in Argentina and indeed that part of the world. So they're used to dealing with that kind of pressure. Yeah, I think there's definitely opportunities there. I mean, there's so many talented young players. I think often it's about making sure that if they do make the move, that they then apply themselves and are guided in the right fashion when they do arrive, and helped along the way. Talking about young Argentine players, as you mentioned, that's even more important with less life experience, with less understanding of how the world works, and they're moving to a new country and the pressure's on them to perform. There's big fee on their head. That's all the more important to make sure that they're being looked after. But no, yeah, of course, Latin America's produced greatest footballers, and Argentina's, they have, in my opinion, the greatest ever now. So there's undoubted huge talents to be explored there. But it's going to be interesting, and it's a shame David isn't on the vocal chat, but how clubs go about that, how they go about scouting, how they go about finding out about players, how they go about character referencing out there, because it can be a bit of a minefield as well, and it is it's a world away from life in the UK or indeed life in Europe. So I'm intrigued to see how clubs go about their business out there.
Absolutely. I mean, actually, again, a point David made when previously talked was around making a choice between a player that needs a work permit and one that doesn't. Because obviously, you still have to fill in a fair amount of paperwork, and as Carol said, there's quite a large section on the form around statistics and having to fill in exactly how many of the available minutes they've played for the club and country and league positions, and there's a lot that goes into it, huge amount of detail, and then obviously you need to still wait for the approval, go through the visa process, and it's a little bit painful on the club side, to be honest with you. So quite often a player that wouldn't have needed to work with the past would have had quite a big advantage in terms of the club just not wanting to risk so much resource and put so much effort in trying to sign someone that eventually might have qualified. But obviously now with nearly every foreign player needing a work permit, a point that David made is they are now a lot more even. So the player that doesn't need a work permit needs to have a more significant advantage. They need to be a whole lot better. And clubs are probably a bit more likely to consider the work permit process as relatively normal going forward if they want to still sign the best talent in the world. Because if you look at Premier League clubs, I don't think they'll be so heavily impacted because they have global knowledge anyway. They scout globally, and even if they don't sign a Korean player, an Australian player, or an African player right away, they are still going to be aware of them and keep tabs on them from quite an early age and maybe sign them when they're 22, 23, as opposed to maybe clubs that at the moment have the bulk of their resource focused on Europe only. Because if you look at club scouting structures, the smaller clubs, and that's anything from lower Premier League to Championship to League 1, League 2. Maybe not so much League 1, League 2 even, but there tends to be a position for a European scouts, and obviously specialist country scouts along the lines of the scouts of Germany, the scouts of Spain, the scouts of Italy. You don't have that many clubs that employ Latin American scouts, probably with the exceptions of the likes of Chelsea, Man United, Man City, the likely candidates. So it's also the question of how they are going to structure scouting going forward.
Definitely.
Because if the world is the playing ground, then they probably need to just identify some countries and some areas where they feel that they have more of an advantage, where they can have better access to top talent, where they can find real value in terms of transfer fees and wages. So quite a lot to consider there.
One thing that I'd add is perhaps whereas before and the clubs had got used to, if you need to get a player in on a work permit, you need to be paying kind of £12 million and 40,000 a week to guarantee the work permit. And so it didn't reward those clubs that were quite savvy negotiators. They could have got that gem from Colombia, say, for the 3 million, and they could have paid him 20,000 a week. And yet that, because they'd done a good deal, they couldn't then get the work permit. But obviously now the criteria isn't, so financially driven. So actually, if you think all it takes is getting that one gem in, you think of the huge saving that you've got, in bringing someone in that's perhaps in uncharted territory, untapped potential, and then that sort of funds the scouting network, doesn't it? So I guess it's the priorities of the club and how they see things. But I suppose, again, taking a step back, there's always been a balancing act with these the work permit criteria of ensuring that there isn't just an influx of sort of foreign players that then inhibit the potential of the homegrown talent. So there needs to be still that route for the domestic talent to come through the ranks. So the Home Office will kind of keep a monitor on how these work permit regulations are working. And if there's this influx of kind of foreign talent that they consider actually it's not really as good as what we could have domestically, and it is preventing the young talent coming through, then there will be a sort of strengthening of these criteria. So it'll be sort of a sort of working project, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And a comment that's been made in chat as well, and something that David would definitely second, is around affiliations worldwide. So obviously, again, if you bring up the Man City network, being able to attract the player to sign to an affiliate club, get games there, and then eventually maybe be able to move to England. That can also obviously be a way to go around that still.
Yeah, I think that's been raised in the chat as well, hasn't it?
Yeah.
By Andrew, yeah. Yeah, because you look, obviously, the likes of City, Leicester, Sheffield United, Brighton, those clubs have all got sort of the satellite clubs, so they're effectively part of the same structure. I guess the alternative to that is the partnership type agreements. I used to advise on those way back when. There were lots of partnership agreements going on, whether it be Europe or South America. I guess the issue with the partnership type agreements is the control that the buying club or the UK club might want to have over players that are still playing with the parent club, and does that then sort of cross the line of third party interest, which FIFA would look to prevent. So there's a sort of balancing act there really, in terms of protecting your interests in a partner club that's overseas, where these players are training and developing, and not having too much influence over players that aren't technically yours yet.
Absolutely. And obviously also coming back to this direction of not being able to bring in players under the age of 18, that probably gives clubs a massive incentive to develop who they have in-house in terms of their own domestic players' British passports, because they can't really bring anyone else in. There's just no option. So obviously it's going to be a bit more competition probably internally between clubs trying to sign the best English talent and really work with it in order to, again, generate value, isn't it?
There's a premium on these players already, but I think there's going to be even more of a premium, isn't there, going forward?
Absolutely. But equally, if you think about, for example, League One, Christian, do you feel that League One clubs would go very far afield to try and find value? Do you think they have a house? Maybe somewhere like Sunderland, but...
Yeah, exactly. I think if, in terms of Latin America, I think it's probably quite a hard push, just purely because of the caliber of player that would need to be leaving South America is unlikely to go to a League One club. In terms of points, they'd probably be an international for one of the top, a national team in the top 50 perhaps, and it'd be unlikely. Wouldn't rule it out, but it would be unlikely. There are opportunities definitely in the Championship. Championship clubs could certainly be looking at something like the Argentine Primera. They could certainly be looking at that as well. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, is that in Band 3, the Primera?
Yeah.
I think that could be an opportunity as well. And the clubs in the EFL has been an extremely difficult time, and we need to take that into account as well when we're talking about transfer fees and wages over the last 9 months as well. And perhaps the financial power isn't quite what it was with bailouts being necessary to sort of continue operating. But then once everything gets back on its feet, then there's no reason why you might not see an increased amount of, again, I'm with my Latin American hat on, Latin American players coming into the Championship with the buying power that they have when we have some sort of normalised financial conditions again. I'm not quite sure when that will be, but it's difficult to say with any certainty now how it's going to play out because of the ongoing situation. Clubs' revenues, particularly in the Football League, are down. They don't have the same TV revenues that, of course, the Premier League clubs do. So they've found this period harder. So actually, you might find it more challenging to come back and compete in the market, and then maybe look to promote from within and go local, which wouldn't be a bad thing for English football.
Yeah, they certainly felt that, especially League 1, League 2 level, the local players are really going to have a real opportunity to get games, especially for younger players.
Yeah.
Because, like you said, these clubs might quite often lack the structure to go that far afield. I mean, if you look at League 1, League 2, there aren't even that many Europeans compared to higher levels who are brought in. So it is what it is. Carol, question for you from the chat. Do under 19 and under 21 caps count in terms of being able to sign and get a work permit?
Yeah, they do. So it's a different criteria for under 21s, but effectively they need to. The category of competitions, it depends. So there's Band 1 youth competitions, which are the finals effectively. So the FIFA under 17s, under 20 World Cup, or the Euros, say. So the finals would be Band 1, so that would get you the most number of points, 7 points. And then if it's Band 2, effectively they're the qualifiers and other sort of international matches that wouldn't be the finals, and that's 5 points. So again, we're looking for the 15 points. So the other types of criteria, has the player made his debut in the last 12 months? And if so, there are points allocated depending on the league that club's in. So obviously the senior team. And then there are other points referable to the player's youth team. So where did that player finish? Where did that player's youth team club finish in the league? How far did they?
I think you might be having a slight connection issue.
I think I'm still here.
But as Carol was saying, the criteria for under 21 players is a little bit more relaxed. But it's also now the question whether clubs are going to use these slots, bearing in mind they only get 6 per year and 3 per transfer window. Whether they are going to use these slots to sign players for the first team, or if they're also going to use these slots to actually still sign players who they want to develop through the 23 system and so on and so forth. Because obviously, normally, pitching a player at the age of 18, 19 to a club to go into their 21s, that's quite a hard pitch for an agent. Because normally around that sort of age, when a club is going to sign a player and pay money for them, they normally want them to already have some proper experience, isn't it? Carol, are you back with us?
Carol there? She might be muted.
Oh,
Carol, I think we can hear you now.
yeah. Am I back?
You seem to be back, yes.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yes.
I didn't hear you. Apologies.
So you were talking about the under 19 and 21s and that the international caps do count, obviously depending on the level of tournament, whether it be required and if it's a final or it's the group stage. Anything else to bear in mind at that point?
Yeah, whether they made a debut for the senior team, and again, what league that team is in and what band that they are in. And then other points are based on the number of the progress of the youth team. So where the youth team finished domestically, how they fared in continental competition, the level of the league that the players playing in youth league as well. And yeah, provided the player has played a certain percentage of those games.
Absolutely. So yes, something we discussed whilst you were away was around whether clubs would then use these slots to sign players for the first team, or whether they might still also give a few of these to players who they might still be looking to develop for the next couple of years. That'll be an interesting one to see.
Yeah.
I think what they will need to be aware of though is if they're bringing a player in, say on a tier 5 visa, and they're looking to extend that tier 5 visa, then there will be reference to has this player been playing games. So I guess that could be a consideration as well. That is this just a squad player or is this a player that's genuinely going to play for the team?
Absolutely, 100%. So Christian, in terms of what agents should bear in mind when it comes to bringing players to the UK and having a successful adaptation, what do you think are the key points to bear in mind?
I think the overriding factor is to consider whether or not it's actually the right move for the client. They need to consider the individualities of the player. Is it in their best interests for them to move at this time to the UK, rather than just looking at the financial package? I think that's extremely important. Ultimately, if it's not in the best interest of the player and it's not the right move, things aren't going to work out. And in the long term and the medium term, that's going to be damaging for everyone involved. They also need to be aware of how they can smooth the process. Clubs now, Premier League clubs, Championship clubs, to an extent League One clubs now as well, are pretty well resourced in terms of player care, as it's known, with people called player liaison officers who will look out after the sort of day-to-day necessities of the players when they first come into the club, helping them out with housing and getting them on their feet, that sort of thing, if they don't speak English. So yeah, I mean, an agent can also look at are there players or individuals from a similar country where their client might be going. If they're a Brazilian player, are there other Brazilians or other Portuguese speakers within the squad, which is going to make their adaptation process a little bit easier and help smooth things over. Same for Spanish player or Spanish-speaking players, makes things a lot easier for them in the adaptation stage, which bodes well for the long term. And of course, are they going to fit into the style of play? Are they the right player? That's obviously critical. So many different points to consider, and the decisions shouldn't be taken lightly. That's for sure. Particularly when there's such a premium on the number of international or the number of spaces available for non-EU players to come, for non-UK players to come and play in England.
And obviously, regulations only came out a couple of weeks ago, but I imagine, Carol, that you already had quite a lot of contacts from clubs, but also maybe agents that you've originally worked with, trying to see how that might then change the business model.
Yeah, absolutely. We're in touch with clubs, UK clubs, as well as agents. I work a lot with South America again, so they're very interested in the scope that this may bring, for their clients. So I definitely think that there's opportunities. There are opportunities, but it's going to take some adapting because it is quite technical and it's sort of quite difficult to work your way through. The regulations are not the most sort of user friendly, to be honest. So we've tried to break it down for our clients and make it into, sort of tables and charts and, something that's a bit more user friendly for them.
Absolutely. I mean, the regulations are 36 pages. So if somebody wants to have a nice quick overview of how the regulations might impact their clients, and if you go on Milton Reed's Twitter, they have fairly nice breakdown with some charts and tables explaining exactly how to make the calculations. And I'm going to be honest, I wouldn't want to be a club secretary right now because they will definitely have to get the calculators out and start looking at minutes and available minutes and injury history and any other reason for being not available for games and then calculating the percentages. It's going to be a very mathematical job, I think.
Yeah, and also we tend to get previously we'd get sort of players, clubs coming to us and saying, well, we really want to sign this player, just want to check with you, he's okay for a work permit, isn't he? And I think now maybe the input from the lawyers is going to come at an earlier stage, at the scouting stage, and there's, this X number of players, and then let's work through the criteria and let's see which one, really has the potential to get through. So I do think because of sort of the objectivity of this process, it might be useful to get the statisticians, the club secretaries, the legal guys, all working at quite an early stage, so that then ultimately, tight resources can be channeled in the right direction.
Absolutely. But I suppose one thing we can take away from this discussion is that there is now a bit more of a level playing field worldwide for players, as opposed to just European Union players being able to play for English clubs quite easily, whereas very, very good players from further fields previously weren't able to get in and now can.
Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely.
Sorry.
No, I was going to say, I would love to know, David, I don't know whether he's there or whether you're in touch with him there, but I'd love to know the extent to which this is going to trigger a change of sort of operational style in sort of championship clubs maybe, and how they do look to explore these other markets, and Premier League clubs as well, of course. But it is going to be fascinating to see how they go about this, and how long it takes for them to get to get to grips with the new conditions. Because I really do think that we could be seeing some exciting arrivals, I hope, from all over the world, particularly South America.
Absolutely. Well, actually, something David said in the point is championship clubs are constantly trying to find value. They're trying to get the wages down. It's such a tight league. It's so competitive. Obviously, everyone has their eyes on a big prize of eventually playing the Premier League. So, something that David feels is that they will obviously be looking to recruit the type of player who can quickly adapt to the championship with a fairly sure bet. So, maybe nothing too adventurous, but if the value is there to be found, and if the innovation is there to create a value, then certainly that would be something that they'd be going after. I mean, I can certainly see clubs like Brentford, who obviously already have a very global knowledge base and lots of statistics behind everything they do, trying to explore the options and see what they can do under new conditions.
Definitely, and then the next exciting thing to see would be, because so few players have done it. A business partner of mine was one of the very few who had done, Julio Arca, who did it back in 2000, coming from Argentina to the northeast of England for Sunderland. So the next interesting thing will be to see how these players that do come directly from South America get on coming direct, because so few of them actually do that.
Absolutely, and we had a very interesting seminar a couple of months ago with Norberto Solano, another Latin American player, obviously, went to the Northeast, and when he first touched down, he didn't even know the English word for hello.
Yeah.
So obviously, he kind of said something along the lines of players having to really own their own adaptation as well, really wanting to be in the club, really wanting to do as much as they can to fit in change rooms, because ultimately, football around the world, despite all the culture and language differences, is really the same. It's the same game. It's the same kind of change room. You'll want to be a part of the team. You'll want to achieve things together. And it's something that he felt very strongly about, was just owning that adaptation yourself as well, and doing as much as you can, going out, making the efforts in terms of meeting people, picking up the language, challenging yourself to just fit in as much as possible.
Yeah, really important point. I think that's just not in football, but that's for anything you do. You have to throw yourself into it to get the most out of it. So you've got to want to do it, and players coming across do have to throw himself in the deep end. I mean, Julio was one similar. He didn't speak a word of English. He always felt that he was a prime target to be ripped off when he first came over. He was a target. Everyone knew who he was. He was an Argentine guy in the Northeast. He'd won the Under-20 World Cup with Argentina, so he came over and he had a bit of a target on his back, but he threw himself into the deep end, and he only left the Northeast last year to go back to Argentina. So he'd been there for almost 20 years, and he played for the local pub team by the end of it. So, I mean, he really threw himself into the local culture there, and I think that's a valuable lesson for any player, and anyone around the player should be encouraging them to do exactly that.
Absolutely, 100%. So we've been talking just for over an hour, and we've also answered the questions from the chat. So any last words from you, Carol?
Actually, it was just in response to a question that Sutherland's put. I don't know whether you'd answered it, but will these new regulations devalue the Premier League brand over time, and could that impact on broadcasting rights? I don't know whether that's been addressed, or is it worth it? Okay. Yeah, well, I actually don't think that's the case at all. I suppose it goes back to my point that I made earlier about that the Home Office will oversee the impact of these regulations, and ultimately, if players are being brought in that are devaluing the brand, that just aren't of the requisite standard, then the regulations are going to change. Also, whilst I think there may be a change in sort of the composition of the team, there might be more non-EU players now than there were before. But I think that probably adds something to the draw of the Premier League. And also, I don't think, I think the clubs know players' worth. They've got the scouting structures in place, or they will have. So the players, I think, that are going to be coming in will be still, exciting top draw players. So yeah, and I guess balancing that with ensuring that the domestic talent can still come through the ranks and still play. So hopefully, we're going to get the best of both worlds. Yeah,
and just to add to that, I totally agree with that. I think there's the potential that, in fact, the league becomes even more diverse. And therefore, again, with my Latin America hat on, Latin America is more La Liga focused. But if you're going to have more South Americans playing in Latin America, you're going to have eyeballs switching to the Premier League, perhaps. And Latin America is a vast, and you shouldn't even group it and just say Latin America, because it's such a diverse and vast area. So, you could make the argument the other way. It could make it a more valuable product, actually.
Absolutely, because it also then brings in interest from all these different markets, which previously wouldn't have had players in the Premier League. I remember definitely when I was a child, I first became interested in the Premier League because there was a player from my country playing it, and that's why I started watching all the games and
exactly.
the history. So there we are. We have another question from the chat, and I think that's again mostly for Carol. Many English clubs can search for new European partner clubs. An agreement could allow under 18 players to stay with the sister club until the age of transfer. Is it possible and is it legal?
So I think it goes back to the point I said before, in terms of what's the contract that's in place. So how far does it stray into influencing? So I think if we talk about, on the one hand, the immigration side of things, well, yes, that would be permissible, because ultimately the players will be staying in in Europe, within the EU, EEA, until the age of 18. And then so from a immigration FIFA perspective, then they can move at that age. But what contracts are you going to have in place to deal with that sort of situation? Ultimately, if this is a third-party club that isn't part of your structure, it's not a subsidiary, it's not a sister club. It's then a third party. So if you're looking to manage when these players can move and what their training and development is going to be like, and bringing them over for the training and some games in the off season and that sort of thing, chances are it may stray into third party influence, which is banned by FIFA. So I guess the flip side is having a club that is part of your overarching structure, and that you own it, therefore it's not a third party then. And the likes of the Cities and Leicester, Sheffield United. But again, I'm sure FIFA's eyes will be on those sorts of structures, ensuring that everything's above board. So yeah, fine line to sort of manage.
Okay, brilliant. Christian, any final comments from you?
Not really, apart from to say that I'm excited to see how it all plays out, and how sort of representatives and clubs manage to get their heads around this. I think we'll be watching with a great deal of intrigue.
Absolutely, and I suppose from myself, from an agent's point of view, I think it's going to definitely impact some business models. So, for example, something I used to do quite heavily was working with EU minors and trying to negotiate transfers to English academies, which is obviously not something I'm going to be doing going forward. Thankfully, I have my German connections, so that will then just obviously mean a complete refocus in that sense. But I think also for many agents, it means a strange strategy in terms of, for example, like you said, Latin American agents developing an increased interest in bringing players to England, and again, considering England as a viable market if it is a real elite player, as well as obviously building up partnerships with agents here who really know the market, know the clubs, and know which kind of players might be successful here, as well as obviously reaching out to people like Christian, who can then help with a number of services once the players are on the ground. Right, everyone. Thank you very much for joining. Thank you for your time. I hope it's been useful. And see you in the next webinars, I suppose, next year.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.